On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a military operation to invade Ukraine in order to eliminate the increasing pressure from NATO on its position in Ukraine, as well as to connect the Crimea enclave it controls to Russian territory. The Russian military planned this operation based on the experience of the Russo-Georgian War and the blitzkrieg tactics used by the German military at the start of World War II, as well as the deep operations theory developed during the Soviet era. The Russian plan called for elite airborne forces to spearhead the breakthrough of Ukrainian defense lines and push deep into the interior. The airborne troops, transported by helicopters and highly mobile vehicles, targeted Ukrainian airfields, transportation hubs, and other key nodes. After the airborne assault, Russian armored columns pushed through the gaps, rapidly dividing and striking at the Ukrainian forces' rear. Simultaneously, the Russian Air Force and missile troops precisely targeted the Ukrainian military's assembly areas, command centers, and radar sites. The Russian aim was to quickly divide the Ukrainian forces, destroy their command structures, and cause the Ukrainian military to waver and collapse. However, the Russians soon found that even when Ukrainian units were surrounded and cut off, many did not break, and instead organized counterattacks. Particularly elite formations like the Azov Regiment, which were composed of Ukraine's most committed nationalists with extensive combat experience in eastern Ukraine. These Ukrainian forces had also been trained by Western militaries and equipped with advanced Western weapons, making them a key component of Ukraine's initial resistance. Additionally, the Russian blitzkrieg failed to achieve decisive results because the Ukrainian military had received comprehensive intelligence support from NATO prior to the war, and thus had advanced knowledge of the Russian attack plans and maintained clear situational awareness throughout the battlefield. The Ukrainian command structure also remained intact, not being crippled as the Russians had hoped. The Russian military encountered numerous difficulties in its attack. Some of the Russian airborne forces were ambushed by Ukrainian forces when assaulting key targets. In contrast, others managed to seize airfields, but were then surrounded and destroyed as the expected follow-on Russian armor forces were delayed in arriving. Many advancing Russian armor columns found their flanks and rears constantly attacked by the Ukrainian military, with the unprotected Russian armor suffering heavy losses and making slow progress. In addition to the Ukrainian forces' strong morale, combat experience, and good intelligence, the most critical reason for the Russian difficulties was a severe shortage of Russian manpower. This Russian troop shortage has been a recurring and fatal weakness throughout the Russia-Ukraine war, with direct connections to Russia's domestic political situation. The Russian military descended from the Soviet Red Army after the collapse of the USSR. Following the two Chechen wars, the Putin government realized that the Russian military inherited from the Red Army was completely unsuited to modern requirements. It was bloated, corrupt, and had low combat effectiveness. Moreover, the Russian military had retained the Soviet Red Army's massive scale, which the economically weak Russia could not adequately support. The Putin government then launched military reforms to transform the Russian military into a smaller, but highly professional and well-equipped force. After over a decade of reforms, the Russian military's main combat units became smaller, but more elite, with some advanced technology and improved combined arms capabilities. This reformed Russian military performed well in the Russo-Georgian War, quickly defeating the Georgian forces, which had received NATO military assistance, though on a much smaller scale than Ukraine today. In 2015, Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war, deploying forces to aid the embattled Assad regime. The Russian military helped Assad's forces defeat rebel and ISIS forces, allowing Assad to retain control over major Syrian territories. In these relatively limited conflicts like the Russo-Georgian War and the Syrian intervention, the elite Russian military was able to effectively execute its missions. When the Russian military launched its invasion of Ukraine, it attacked from the north, south, and east simultaneously, establishing a front line stretching over 1,500 kilometers across multiple directions. This extensive battlefront, exposed the Russian military's fatal weakness: a shortage of troops. With such a long and wide-ranging front line, the Russian forces simply lacked the manpower to effectively cover and defend the entire area. While the elite Russian airborne forces were able to seize key objectives and breach the Ukrainian defenses, there were insufficient follow-on Russian troops to exploit and expand these breakthroughs. The large gaps left in the Russian advance allowed the Ukrainian military to freely attack the overextended Russian assault columns and supply lines. Although the Russian forces pushed close to Kiev at great cost, in late March 2022, Russian forces withdrew from the areas near Kyiv. Russia claimed the withdrawal from Kyiv was in accordance with an agreement reached in Turkey. From a military perspective, the key reason was that the Russian forces were unable to sustain their extended front line and had become overextended. The lack of sufficient Russian troops to cover the 1,500-kilometer front line was a critical factor in the decision to withdraw from the Kyiv region. A similar situation occurred around Kherson in the fall of 2022, with the new Russian commander Surovikin recognizing the Russian forces there were in a precarious position with threatened supply lines, leading to a rapid Russian withdrawal from Kherson. After withdrawing from the Kyiv and Kherson regions, the new Russian commander Surovikin adopted a more cautious tactic. In the areas of Ukraine's southeast that Russia controls, from Zaporizhia to Crimea, the Russian military constructed the so-called Surovikin defense line, a series of fortified positions, including minefields, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles, backed by powerful artillery and air forces. Strategically, this defense line was intended to prevent Ukrainian offensives in the region and ensure the land connection between Crimea and eastern Ukrainian territories under Russian control, preventing Crimea from being isolated and potentially attacked. This period of relative stalemate lasted from late 2022 into early 2023, as both sides regrouped and consolidated their forces. The Ukrainian military also needed time to receive more advanced Western weapons and organize additional armored brigades with NATO assistance. In the summer of 2023, the Ukrainian military concentrated its newly organized armored brigades and launched a major offensive towards Zaporizhia. However, this area had already been fortified by the Russian forces into a formidable defense line. The Ukrainian attack suffered heavy losses, both in equipment and in experienced veteran fighters like the Azov regiment. The gains made were far less than expected. Many international military observers, including some Western analysts, considered this Ukrainian offensive to be a strategic blunder. While holding off the Ukrainian push, the Russian military also concentrated forces to attack the Ukrainian defensive lines in the Donetsk region. Due to Russian troop shortages, Putin brought in the Wagner mercenary group, which he had previously cultivated in Africa. Led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner was a battle-hardened and experienced private military force that was deployed to assault the key Ukrainian fortress of Bakhmut. After a long and costly battle, Wagner forces eventually captured Bakhmut, but not without intense conflict between Wagner and the Russian military leadership. In fact, after taking Bakhmut in June 2023, Prigozhin launched a mutiny and marched on Moscow. This crisis was eventually resolved with the mediation of Belarusian President Lukashenko, but it dealt a blow to the authority of the Putin regime. The Wagner incident highlighted several key issues. The Russian military truly suffers from a severe troop shortage. Even after reforms, the Russian forces lacked the manpower to effectively prosecute a large-scale, high-intensity war, forcing Putin to rely on unreliable mercenary groups. The employment of mercenary forces like Wagner created command, personnel, and funding conflicts outside the Russian government's full control, contributing to the mutiny incident. Even after the Wagner crisis, Putin has struggled to resolve Russia's manpower problems, which are fundamentally rooted in the country's entrenched, oligarchic political system that has persisted since the Soviet collapse. Since the Soviet collapse, Russia's political structure has been dominated by regional oligarchs and strongmen controlling local economic and social resources. This has made it very difficult for the federal government to mobilize conscripts from the different regions and republics. In this war, Russia has resorted to compulsory conscription quotas imposed on the regions, leading to significant discontent and instability. As a result, the Russian military has become heavily dependent on contract soldiers and even recruiting prisoners to supplement its forces, exposing the limitations of the Russian government's ability to effectively mobilize resources and manpower. This contrasts sharply with the Soviet era, when the Communist Party's centralized control allowed for the national mobilization of people and materials to fight the Nazis. Russia's federal system makes replicating that level of centralized mobilization very challenging. To address this, Putin has used political maneuvering to divide and undermine the influence of these entrenched regional interests and oligarch groups. For example, after the Wagner mutiny, Putin disbanded the mercenary group and purged its leadership. He's also appointed new defense ministers to root out corruption and install more loyalists in the military leadership and government. Additionally, Putin has launched a Heroes Era program to promote and elevate mid-level officers with combat experience in the war into positions of power at the federal and local levels. This is an attempt to build a new power base to counter the regional elites. However, these power struggles are not quickly resolved, and the various Russian interest groups are unlikely to go down without a fight. Putin continues to be hampered by the scarcity of resources for the war effort. After the Wagner mutiny, Russia adjusted its military leadership and strategy. While stabilizing the Crimea-Zaporizhia line, Russia intensified attacks in the Donetsk region to capture Luhansk and Donetsk as per Putin's war aims. Russia introduced precision-guided weapons like glide bombs that can strike from outside air defense range. This allowed Russia to quickly capture fortified Ukrainian towns without costly urban battles, helping mitigate its troop shortages. Initially, the Russian Air Force was able to suppress the Ukrainian Air Force, as the Ukrainian air fleet was inferior in both quantity and quality compared to Russia's. Despite some tactical victories with NATO assistance, the Ukrainian Air Force was overall outmatched by the Russians. However, Ukraine's air defenses, including its own S-300 systems as well as newer Western-provided air defense equipment, took a heavy toll on the Russian Air Force in the early stages of the war. This forced the Russian Air Force to scale back its direct air support and air-to-ground strikes for an extended period, as both sides struggled to maintain air superiority. The game-changer was Russia's introduction of precision-guided glide bombs that could be launched from outside the range of Ukraine's air defenses. These devastated Ukrainian fortified positions without the need for costly close air support. To counter this threat, Ukraine was compelled to move its air defense systems closer to the front lines, making them more vulnerable to Russian reconnaissance and strikes. Many Ukrainian air defense sites were then destroyed by Russian drones and missiles. While the U.S. has also provided Ukraine with similar precision munitions, Ukraine's air force remained suppressed by Russia, unable to safely deliver these weapons from the air. This underscores Ukraine's urgent need for Western-supplied F-16 fighters to suppress the Russian Air Force's ground attack capability. While Ukrainian pilots would need extensive 1 to 2 year training to operate F-16 fighter jets, the West would also have to help Ukraine establish a complete logistics, air command, and joint operations system meeting NATO standards for the F-16s to be truly effective. In fact, the F-16 is not even NATO's most advanced fighter. It belongs to the same generation as Russia's Su-30 and Su-35 jets currently in service. Furthermore, the F-16s planned to be provided to Ukraine are older models, not the latest variants. So even if Ukraine's Air Force could fully master the F-16, these relatively dated fighters would still struggle against Russia's heavy flight Su-35s. Unless NATO air forces intervene in Ukraine in strength like the Soviet Air Force did during the Korean War, using more advanced fighters like the F-35, they are unlikely to effectively suppress the Russian Air Force and achieve air superiority. But such direct NATO-Russia confrontation would immediately escalate the war, with political, military, and economic costs that Western nations are reluctant to bear. The Russian forces are currently not only leveraging their air superiority to strike Ukrainian strongholds, but have also shifted away from their previous large-scale infantry assaults on the ground. They are now employing numerous small-scale assault groups to continuously probe the Ukrainian defensive lines, searching for weaknesses. Once identified, they then call in airstrikes to bomb those vulnerable points, enabling them to break through. The Russian forces have been making steady progress along the Donbas front, putting immense pressure on the Ukrainian military. The Russian Air Force's deployment of large, precision-guided glide bombs has inflicted heavy casualties on the Ukrainian troops, particularly their experienced veteran soldiers, a loss that will be extremely difficult for Ukraine to recover from. The prolonged conflict has begun to fracture Western support for Ukraine, particularly as some European nations have started to oppose continued aid. The dissenting voices of leaders in Hungary, Slovakia, and certain political parties indicate that the war's long-term drain is impacting these countries' domestic politics, public support, and resource constraints. This suggests the war's continuation could influence Western strategic choices, especially for the US, where a Republican election victory may significantly alter the stance on supporting Ukraine. Particularly the Trump camp strongly opposes further aid. For Ukraine, this means losing some external backing, likely exacerbating their battlefield predicament. Amid waning US support, Ukraine may face greater strategic isolation, and reduced Western assistance could hinder their ability to sustain resistance against Russian forces. Despite the Russian military's tactical gains on the battlefield, Russia itself faces significant challenges. In October 2024, Ukraine launched an offensive with its remaining elite forces in the Kursk region, where Russian defenses were relatively weak. The Ukrainian forces initially made substantial progress, but after the Russians deployed air power and a small number of elite units, they stabilized the front line. Militarily, Ukraine's attack on Kursk was aimed at forcing Russia to withdraw troops from the Donetsk region to reinforce Kursk, relieving pressure on the Ukrainian forces there. Politically, it was a signal to the West that Ukraine still retained offensive capabilities worthy of continued support. However, Russia did not pull forces from Donetsk as Ukraine had hoped, and instead maintained the offensive pressure. Many military analysts have questioned whether Ukraine's use of precious elite units at Kursk was truly worthwhile. Yet the Russian manpower shortage was again exposed, as they lacked sufficient forces to decisively expel the Ukrainian military from the Kursk region. Consequently, Putin reportedly requested assistance from North Korea, with an estimated 15,000 North Korean troops said to be undergoing pre-deployment training in Russia. There are even reports of clashes between Ukrainian and North Korean forces in Kursk, a humbling development for the proud Russian, now relying on foreign troops to defend Russian territory. China is another major supporter of Russia in this conflict. China's assistance comes in two key areas. First, China has provided some high-tech capabilities. Russia may have received Chinese technological assistance in the fields of drone technology and even glide-guided bomb technology. China has also supplied Russia with many components, especially microchips, for advanced weapon systems. Secondly, China has offered critical financial backing. After Russia's full isolation from the Western financial system, China has used its own financial infrastructure to help sustain the Russian economy. China's foreign exchange reserves and resource wealth have almost certainly poured substantial resources into enabling Russia's economic functioning. Without this Chinese financial aid, Russia's current economic stability would be in jeopardy. However, China's support for Russia comes at an immense economic cost for itself. China is already grappling with a severe economic downturn in its real estate, stock markets, and local debt issues. Continuing to back Russia's war effort is a major drag on China's own interests. The economic toll on China is substantial as it tries to prop up its Russian ally. The analysis shows both Russia and Ukraine, as well as their respective backers, face immense challenges, providing a realistic basis for ending the war. President-elect Trump has repeatedly claimed he would end the Russia-Ukraine conflict on his first day in office, likely political rhetoric, but indicative of it being a top priority for his administration. Reports suggest Trump's ceasefire plan may involve Ukraine accepting Russia's occupation of some territories, trading land for peace. While Ukraine has portrayed an unwavering, fight-to-the-last stance, geopolitical realities often override moral ideals. Past examples like Finland ceding territory to the Soviet Union demonstrate how power dynamics can force pragmatic concessions. Trump is expected to apply pressure on both sides to end the conflict. He may leverage U.S. aid as bargaining chips with Ukraine, threatening to cut off support if they reject his plan. Should Ukraine reject Trump's proposal, a Ukraine deprived of aid would risk losing additional territory and could face domestic political upheaval. For Russia, Trump could open U.S. energy production to lower global prices, crippling Russia's economic war potential, while also drawing red lines Russia cannot cross without facing increased military aid to Ukraine, even potential NATO intervention. If the terms are acceptable, as a sophisticated politician, a Machiavellian, Putin should accept territorial concessions at the right markup in exchange for domestic political stability. The Trump government will likely increase pressure on China, India, and Turkey, major supporters of Russia's war efforts. Regarding China, measures may include targeting China's financial system, imposing tariffs, bargaining on issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan to get China to limit assistance. For India and Turkey, who have profited from the conflict, Trump is expected to apply diplomatic and economic pressure to reduce their backing of Russia and undermine Russia's war capacity. Trump is expected to employ a range of coercive tactics to achieve this. All parties, including Putin's government, can anticipate that the Trump administration's ascension will be a key turning point in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia will likely launch one or more major offensives this winter, aiming to make further gains on the battlefield and recapture the Kursk region to strengthen its negotiating position. Ukraine, facing a change in its primary backer, the U.S., and with European countries preoccupied by winter energy demands, will struggle to bolster its defenses over the winter. If Russian attacks falter, Ukraine's situation may improve, but the overall dynamics are unlikely to shift decisively. However, if Ukraine suffers a catastrophic collapse, Russia may become more reluctant to negotiate a ceasefire. The most probable scenario is Russia achieving some advances, but Ukraine maintaining the ability to mount effective counterattacks and defensive actions, leading Russia to conclude continued offensives are too costly. This could prompt formal negotiations to begin in the spring. The negotiations would likely follow the precedent of the Korean War, a complete ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, with a dividing line and demilitarized zone. This would allow Ukraine to legally retain its claimed territories, while Russia can claim to have achieved the aims of its special military operation. As with the Korea War, the process would involve back and forth on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, with an anticipated ceasefire agreement by fall 2025. However, this would not be a true end to the conflict, but potentially a precursor to future larger confrontations. If a Third World War breaks out in a quarter of the world's regions in the future, the Russia-Ukraine land may once again ignite in flames, continuing this unfinished war. Recently, after receiving approval from the Biden administration, Ukrainian forces employed U.S. ATACMS short-range ballistic missiles to strike multiple targets within Russian territory. Concurrently, the British government authorized Ukraine to use Storm Shadow cruise missiles for similar strikes. In response, Russia executed its first medium-range ballistic missile attack with a conventional warhead, targeting a Ukrainian factory. Furthermore, Russia has modified its nuclear weapon usage manual, effectively lowering the threshold for potential nuclear deployment. These developments have intensified global apprehensions about the potential outbreak of nuclear conflict. However, upon reviewing the entire trajectory of the Russo-Ukrainian war, including both sides' strategic approaches, target selection, and the scope, velocity, and volume of Western military assistance to Ukraine, I maintain that this conflict remains a controlled, limited war. Ukraine's use of ATAK-EMS to strike Russian targets does not alter the prediction made in this analysis. A fundamental shift would only occur under two extreme scenarios: if Ukraine directly targets Russian nuclear facilities, or the Kremlin, or if NATO military forces formally and massively engage in direct combat with Russian troops. Therefore, we must continue to observe how events will unfold.